And so this is, oh, my mic is on. Testing.
So there's going to be a little bit of a microphone juggle. start up the live stream now in advance of 4 o'clock. Good. YouTube's good. The HDR is rolling too. Great. We can open up the waiting room also. Good. And we can unmute the mic. We're good. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's fourth space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, The Tipping Point, when politics take aim at culture and education. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Fourth Space, but we are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Chichage, Montreal. In the Fourth Space, we work with the university community to mobilize knowledge, co-create daily activities that examine research questions and projects in development here at the university. We're running this hybrid event as a Zoom meeting as well, so any comments or questions there, please raise your hand or ask us via the chat, and we'll try to get those to everyone. And anyone in the space, of course, during a Q&A, if you'd like to participate, just raise your hand. We'll get one of our microphones to you then. And with that, it's very much my pleasure to hand it to Mark Sussman, who's director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture, to introduce today. Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Sussman from the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I was very pleased when Patrick and Marco came to CISC to discuss organizing these two events today, today's roundtable and tomorrow's seminars, which will take place in Concordia's library right upstairs. I'd like to make sure that you in the room and on the live stream know that CISC runs 8 different working groups on interdisciplinary topics. Some of them are open to the public, some of them are more closed, intimate discussions among researchers at the university. They're all interdisciplinary, they're all quite fascinating, and they're all listed on the CISC website, which is part of Concordia's website. So that's CISSC, CISC. Our next event this fall will also be here in Fourth Space on October 27th from noon to 2 p.m. and it will be an artist talk by Shelley Bowell, who is a Canadian artist in residence in New York City, who will be a guest of the South-South working group of CISC. So if you're on campus, please come on October 27th. And I will now turn it over to Patrick to introduce our speakers today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you to CISC and to the Fourth Space for having us. This is really an extraordinary opportunity to basically think through what's happening. This started off as various conversations that I'll get back to in a second. But we have noticed that in the past decade, we've seen a rise in populist governments taking aim at culture, at education, going so far as to close programs, as we'll hear, change college boards, as we saw recently in Florida, actually affect entire universities, as we saw with the Central European University that was no longer welcomed in Hungary and had to move to Vienna. We've seen also the dismantling of the existing cultural infrastructure in Brazil very quickly under Bolsonaro, as Marco will tell us in a moment. So what can we learn from these recent cases of overt government intervention to curtail our academic freedom, to redefine the field of academic inquiry? How do we prepare and protect these institutions from opportunistic politics? And I'd like to ask eventually, what place is there for dialogue, and can dialogue help? So I'll present our four speakers. So we have two speakers and two respondents today. It's sort of the formula we imagined. And tomorrow we'll have actual workshops co-led by our colleagues. So Marco Bortoleto is an associate professor at the Universidade Estadual de Campinas in Brazil, and currently postdoctoral fellow here at Concordia University, where we have the pleasure of working together. He's specialized in physical education, and he's, I have to say, he is the major force in contemporary circus research in Brazil. And we have engaged in dialogues for years. And he's also the president of the International Gymnastics Federation Education Commission. So in dialogue with various Olympians and various international Olympic commissions. Amy Reid is a professor of French and Gender Studies, director of the Gender Studies program at the New College of Florida, which we'll hear about quite a bit today. As chairs of the New College faculty, she now sits on the NCF Board of Trustees, which is an interesting, complicated place to be in, I'm sure. And this board in August voted to abolish the Gender Studies program. Kimberley Manning is a professor of political science and women's studies. She's the principal of Concordia's Simone de Beauvoir Institute. Dr. Manning specializes in gender politics with a particular focus on China's revolutionary past. Her book, The Family Party, just out. Is it out now officially? It is just out. Her work focuses on the contemporary Canadian mobilization of transgender children and youth and their families, in addition to other forms of equity-seeking research projects. Jean François Mayer is an associate professor in political science at Concordia University. He specializes in comparative politics, focusing on civil society organizations, social movements, and labor politics in Latin America, especially in Brazil and Mexico. And it was great a few moments ago. I could hear three of them speaking in Portuguese, which is a rarity, I'm sure, Marco, for you to experience in Montreal. So I'd like to first invite our international guests to present their particular situations, their lived experiences with this tipping point that we'll be talking about. And we'll follow up with the responses and a conversation with you present and online. And thanks for being there and being so many of you. This is great. Post-pandemic, there's like a crowd. This is exciting. So Marco, our conversation on what's happening in Brazil under Bolsonaro started, I think it was in December 2018, when I was there, and it was a few weeks before Bolsonaro took office. So he had been elected, and there was just a sense of doom. No one knew exactly what was going to happen. And lo and behold, he almost immediately cut arts funding, suspended professors' salaries in the federal universities. And 5 years later, we've seen the full cycle of what has happened under Bolsonaro in Brazil. And we'd like to hear about this. And what happened? What lessons did you learn? And how can we get out of this? Marco.
Thank you, Patrick. And hello, everyone. So I'm sorry about my poor English. I will do my best to communicate well, although we could speak in Portuguese. Some of you speak very well Portuguese. So yes, that's true. I think our conversation about this political changing started many years ago. And now after years, we can speak a little bit better or having a different perspective about it. That's why I'm going to try to contextualize a little bit what happened, and from my perspective, how this political understanding impact, especially education and arts sector. So that's why I named my short presentation about this political eclipse in education and arts, because it's the feeling we have more or less in Brazil. And I also add this idea about almost successful, because I think in many ways we found a way how to resist all this oppression we got during this year. So let's see how I can show you it's important to understand better the situation. What it's happening in Brazil, that we have this military regime for a long time in Brazil, and then only in 1985 we really redemocratized our country. So in that time, I remember that the idea to one of the first measures that the government took in that time was, okay, we have to have a Ministry of Culture. And for 30 years, this was one of our legacy, for the democratic legacy, to have culture as one of the most important topics in our country. And then, as I will show you very soon, this was the first, I would say, minister that the new government, the Bolsonaro government, just delete from our system. The first measure that they did in their government was to delete the Minister of Culture. And that show a little bit how they act. So in 1989, we had our first democratic elections. So for more than 30 years, or almost 30 years, we realized, oh, we are a young country with young democracy, but it's quite stable. So we believe in that time we have our democracy very stable. But we realized it was a very big mistake years later. So that's one very important thing. And when the government, the Bolsonaro, got power in the end of the 2018 and started his government in 2019, I think we should understand the situation combining two different things. First was his government, and second was the pandemics. What we are saying in Brazil after 5 years after that, we realized we had in parallel two different pandemics. One concerning sanitary aspects, and the other one concerning political aspect. It is interesting because we never thought in our life, in our young democracy, this could be happen. Both of this pandemic was surprising us, and we learned a lot this, and that's why I'm trying to speak about this today with you. I remember clearly, Patrick, in our conversation, I said, oh, if something like that is happening in Brazil and we still are living these consequences, we should talk more about that before it happens in many, many other places. And the thing we are noting right now is it's ongoing in many, many different places. So if we're not really aware, and if we are not talking about this in a very free way, I'm really afraid that this can happen more, again in Brazil, but more in different other countries. So that's my preoccupation, and thank you for opening this opportunity to talk about that. So during this 4 years government, I have no words to describe what happened in our society. All these words we can see right now: oppression, disrespect, anti-democratic measures, fear, violence. All this became so common. We are in a very, I would say, in a development country. We know we have so many problems already. We are trying to, I would say, to overcome this problem for a long time, but we never have in our recent history so many, I would say, bad feelings like we had in these 4 years. And this really transformed the perceptions our population has about everything. So although we live in an unsafe country in many, many aspects, it became more and more unsafe in many other aspects that we are not really ready for that. We are not prepared for that. So one of the things we also observed in these 4 years of Bolsonaro government was the very fast transitions or changing in the power in all the levels of power, from the very high level, the ministerial level, to the very, I would say, ground level, bringing more and more military people and more religious people to the power. It was very fast. In less than 1 year, they changed almost 50% of all the political positions in Brazil for militaries and religious people. In this graph, it's a very clear message. We jumped from 3,500 military in civil positions, in politics position, for 6,000, double in 1 year. It's unbelievable how fast they did this change and how we were not ready for this kind of change. And they include in this change also, for example, our Minister of Education. We have a counter that is very strong in education. Brazil has a very long trajectory in education, and they change our Minister of Education for a military person from one day to other, like nothing. They never ask the universities or intellectual people or all the people around education who should be the person in charge of education, their government. They just decide, oh, it should be a military person. So that surprised everybody inside or outside of the education field. So it was a big sign about, okay, we are entering and enriching our culture war. We saw this happening in a very school level, but also in the university level, how culture became a war in scenario or war situation. So as I said before, the culture and education was completely their target in the first year. So they decide, oh, this is what we have to destroy and to silence as much as we can. So we started to see how easy for the government, when they get the power, it's to change things more than we really believe in the beginning. They were fast, but also they were dramatic in the changing. But in the same time, we realize we still have a population ready to resist. So in the same time, they start to implement their big changing. We also noted a kind of resistance growing and growing from bottom, from the very regular population, not from the very well organized classes. So the ground population was the first part of the population who start to react from all of this. And as a case example, and it's close by my experience in the field, is on circus. Our national circus schools are 40 years institution, so it's a very important institution in Brazil. It's a federal institution. In 2 weeks, they just removed the director of the school, and this person is a very important person. 1 month after he lost his position at our national school, he got a position as a director of the French National Circus Schools in France, which means he's a very competent person, but the government removed him because of his positions. And it was a clear sign from the government say, oh, we want to control all the institutions. And they did this. The National Circus Schools is one example, but they did in all levels and all arts education, but also environmental institutions. They did this very, very fast and very, very strongly. In this case, what they did was, okay, let's close the school. And we had our national circus schools closed for more than 1 year with no information, no transparency, nothing about. So everybody involved in circus in Brazil was asking, oh, what happened with our national circus school? And I think this is another important topic we have to be aware. When they get the power, they start to control all the communication, and they manipulate a lot of this. So transparency just disappeared from our government. From the economic point of view to the institutional point of view, they start to control, and of course they disappear of any kind of transparency. So we could not understand what happened, no information about that. So just as an example of how these kind of measures or how these political decisions impact our population, this is a clear and sadly impacts. So for many people involved in circus, we have more than 800 circus active in Brazil. It's a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people, families live based in what they can produce as an artist. So they were impacted in a very bad way. So we saw something that was not imagined and not we could not imagine before. We saw artists really asking for food. They could not work because of the pandemic, but they also could not work because the government just removed them from any program, any kind of support. And it was a clear message for the cultural sector. So we don't want you close, and we need your space in order to move our political proposal forward. So you cannot be here. And we saw for the first time in the last 50 years, people asking for food, but not in the very poor communities in our favelas, but also artists asking for food, which is really, really dramatic and really, really bad when you see some of your colleagues asking for food. It's very, very impactful. So I brought this idea about social acceleration for Hartmut, for the sociologist Hartmut Rosa, the German sociologist, because it looks like for me a good way how to think about how fast is this changing. It's surprise, and to be honest, all the institutions that normally are resisting for any political change, they were not really ready for how fast was the changing. So in the environment, our environment problems, our food intake problems, our election and voting system was questioned and putting in some problems because of the government. So everything we have already installed in Brazil, and we really trust, oh, we have a very good country. We know how to treat or how to deal with our environment things. We know how to deliver and have good programs to deliver food for our population. In less than 1 year, we felt like, oh, we lost all of this. And we have the feeling we are going back 100 years ago. And that's exactly the feeling of our population. So just to finalize my first speech is about, as I said before, in the same time, we noted this pressure from the government to remove all these institutions, all these cultural and artistic sector from their way. We also note how social mobilization activism, especially in the very ground level, could resist from all of this. And then I think in the third year of the government, we note how important is our mobilization as artists, as a cultural people, as educational people. And we note how many people really started to fight against this oppression. And for me, it shows we still have a lot to learn from this critical situation, especially for young population. We had more mobilization in very young and poor population than ever before, which is very interesting. We are listening all the time. Young people are not engaged in politics. This is not really what happens in Brazil. They are more than we expect. And they were the first part of our population that started to say, no, we are not agreeing with this situation. Young, not well-educated people, but very engaged in what they believe it is important for life. And it was not coming from the university, for example. The first movement was not at the university level. It was in the very community level. It's a very interesting difference from the past. So now we believe we now have a new government. We hope they have the time enough to rebuild, to reorganize, because what we note, talking with a lot of people now working in the government, what they found was a complete disaster. Everything destroyed in the government, all the programs we had. So they are now spending a lot of time, money, and energy to rebuild. So it takes time, but it looks like we are now trying to reconnect with our roots and trying to have, again, a very democratic and transparent nation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco. This really, I think, sets the stage and gives us a sense of well, the urgency with which we need to be aware of what's happening, the rapidity with which those changes can be brought forth. And we're now in parallel situation in Florida. Just for context, Amy and I first met. Actually, I had the pleasure and privilege of spending some time at the new college in Sarasota during a conference. It was the American Council for Connect Studies, and I was taken by the campus. It's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I just remember thinking, this is where I want to end my career. It's by Sarasota Bay. There's the Ringling House. I saw a dolphin. I swear I did, and I just thought, what an amazing place. And then lo and behold, this thing happened. What has happened?
Okay, so I have some prepared comments that I hope will help to explain what has been happening in Sarasota, turning sort of an idyllic place where it's been, frankly, a real privilege to teach for almost 30 years into, well, putting us in the crosshairs of culture wars in Florida and in the United States. So for me and for New College, the small public liberal arts college where I teach, the tipping point has a very precise date, January 6th, 2023. But I want to begin my comments by going back about a month before that. In December of 2022, I read Celeste Ng's novel, Our Missing Hearts. It was my holiday present to myself after a bad semester. The novel is wonderful and it's beautiful and it's heartbreaking, and it literally brought me to tears. It is Ng's response to the rise of xenophobia in the US, specifically the rise of anti-Asian sentiment and a wave of violent attacks against Asian communities across the US. In her dystopian vision of our present, anti-Asian sentiment has been codified by law into a set of measures that claim to protect our culture and traditions, pact, but yet actually take away the right to free speech, stoke xenophobic violence, cull books from libraries, and remove children from families deemed inappropriate. Sounds a little too familiar. Ng's novel brings into focus the danger the US now faces because of how xenophobia directed against not just racial minorities, but also LGBTQ communities and education is being instrumentalized for political aims and justified with false claims of protecting children. In December 2022, I was already worried about the political polarization fraying our social fabric and erupting in bursts of violence. My own next door neighbor had in fact threatened to come after me and my kids with a baseball bat after Trump's loss in the 2020 presidential election. I was worried because of the rhetoric and political maneuvers of politicians in Florida, specifically our newly reelected governor, Ron DeSantis, who'd orchestrated the passage of a series of laws that not only limit discussions of gender and sexuality in public schools, but take aim at higher education broadly, decrying universities as sites of left-wing indoctrination and seeking to replace the trust that is the bedrock of good pedagogy with fear and threats. I was also in the midst of planning a day-long workshop for our campus on the challenges of teaching about race and gender in Florida, a workshop we held in late January, but that my colleagues and I named obliquely Conversations About Teaching, because what we needed to discuss then was precisely the dangers we faced as teachers in Florida, and we were already afraid to say that too openly. And still, I had no idea that the tipping point was so close at hand. On January 6th, our campus was turned upside down. The date is no coincidence. This is the 2-year anniversary of the Trump-inspired insurrection in Washington, D.C. Governor Ron DeSantis, with eyes already on the Republican presidential campaign, decided to turn our small campus into the showcase for his plans for education across the country. Under the guise of protecting students from leftist indoctrination and gender ideology and returning Florida to conservative Christian values, he appointed a new majority to our board of trustees. Their rhetoric was in turn military and violent. They described arriving as a siege and that troops were over the walls, and also religious. They had a mission to remake New College on the model of Hillsdale College, which is a private right-wing Christian school in Michigan. They threatened to fire all the faculty. They denied tenure to 5 highly qualified candidates, all women and/or people of color, and said the students who weren't mission aligned could just leave. The board moved quickly to remove campus leaders who were women, LGBTQ, or members of visible or religious minorities. Within weeks, they fired our president, Pat Oker, who was a white woman and the first woman president of the institution. She'd served just 18 months. And our dean of diversity, a trans person of color. They shuttered our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. They removed our provost, another white woman, and our head research librarian, an openly queer Jewish woman. To be clear, those they fired and forced out were not exclusively women or LGBTQ or people of color, but the administration was clear that their goal was to reset the gender imbalance on our campus. One new board member went so far as to write a blog post that decried the feminization of the American university, arguing that too many women faculty, administrators, and students had made the university a hysterical space. They had a two-part strategy to shift the gender balance of our student body, which, as at most liberal arts colleges across the US, was majority female. And our college in recent years had a large plurality, sometimes even a majority of LGBTQ students. First, they pushed out current students, especially those who are queer. They closed themed dorms dedicated to Africana studies and pride. They removed signage for gender neutral bathrooms. They tore down the sign for the Gender and Diversity Center and abolished the gender studies program. I am sort of Schrodinger's department. I'm still nominally the director of our gender studies program without any budget or faculty at the moment. They used the student code of conduct to target queer students on campus, threatening expulsion and making it clear who is and who is not welcome. We lost over 27% of our students. Then they launched an athletic program, hiring coaches and recruiting students from conservative Christian schools. New College is the public school with an enrollment between 700 and 800. In just 4 months, they recruited over 125 athletes for this year's incoming class. And since those athletes are about 80% male, we have for the first time in 30 years an incoming class that is majority male. In terms of faculty, between early retirements, unpaid leaves, and resignations, we lost over a third of our 90 or so faculty, and more will be leaving this year. Our one tenure track faculty member in gender studies resigned in August, and this past week it was confirmed that the president will not authorize us to fill that line, despite strong support from the program from the remaining faculty. A climate of fear reigns on campus. The administration says it supports civil discourse, but it is quick to censor dissent. Unknown administrators review emails sent to the campus and decide which announcements are appropriate or not. The shelves of books in the Pride dorm were thrown out over the summer, as were books about gender that were on a free table in my office building. In both cases, students and staff dumpster dived to save the books they could. In January, until January, chalking had been the environmentally sensitive way students in campus offices publicized events on campus. Now, the campus police threaten to charge students with criminal mischief for chalking, even though a fairly recent court case in Sarasota confirms that chalking is a protected form of speech. Last week, a message from the administration about the war in Israel and Gaza eschewed any expression of mourning, compassion, or hopes for peace, instead reminding us that any support for a terrorist organization could result in felony charges. There is no right to academic freedom or speech in such a climate of fear. Unfortunately, what we see at New College is a mirror for what is going on across the state. Administrative actions on our campus reflect the legal strategies of the governor's administration, attacking free speech, attacking the rights of LGBTQ folks and women, targeting individuals to make clear to the larger community the danger of speaking up against their policies. Statewide moves against free speech include laws like Don't Say Gay, Stop Woke, and the Viewpoint Protection Act, which were all passed in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. And they curtail the ability of teachers to speak out about issues of gender and race, and frankly, history. Senate Bill 266, which the governor signed into law on our campus in May, not only prohibits the use of any state funds to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, or social and political activism, which is the code they're using for gender studies. We're not academic, we're activist. It also removes tenure protections and the rights of faculty to arbitration if they are terminated. The governor banned an advanced placement course for high school students that would teach about African-American history, and also introduced a new K-12 curriculum for Florida history that emphasizes the beneficial skills enslaved people learned. 2 state attorneys, elected officials from Tampa and Orlando, have been removed from office by the governor because of their opposition to laws curtailing abortion access and for pledging not to prosecute individuals for transgender-related crimes, like using the bathroom. As of July 1st, Florida has a trans bathroom ban, making it a crime for a trans person to use the appropriate bathroom. And the K-12 and state college systems, which are like the Cégep here in Quebec, set regulations stipulating that staff who do not enforce this ban will be fired. Remember, on our campus, the administration removed all gender-neutral bathroom signs even before that law went into effect. The state also banned gender-affirming care for minors and raised the threat that children exposed to gender-affirming care can be removed from their families. Trans students are not just leaving New College, although they are, families are leaving the state of Florida. The situation is dire. So where does this leave us? The Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a tipping point as, quote, the critical point in a situation, process, or system beyond which a significant and often unstoppable effect or change takes place. To that definition, I'll add 2 precisions. The first, which echoes Marco's point, is acceleration. As we reach a tipping point, the rate of change speeds up and cascades. This is part of what makes it feel unstoppable, and what has happened on our campus over the past 10 months illustrates that. But also, I want to stress that the consequences of the tipping point are not necessarily unstoppable. They can be contained and reversed, and so we can and must resist. I'll admit I don't have much hope for New College. Too much damage has been done this year, too many faculty and students have left, and frankly, too much state capital has been expended on making us an example of the power the state wields. But I do see hope for Florida, in the midterm at least. And I believe that our resistance is important for forestalling the spread of dangerous ideologies and policies. That's why I took a position as chair of the New College faculty, which means I now sit on our hostile board of trustees. And it's why I'm here today at Concordia. So let me conclude with just a few places where I can see some glimmers of hope for our resistance. First, legal challenges. Stop Woke has been stayed by a federal court, meaning its provisions can't be enforced on the university level, pending the resolution of First Amendment legal challenges. Although the government is also using other laws to sort of get around this by having other bills that mimic the effects. Judge Mark Walker, when he stayed the law, described the state's position, which is that professors do not have free speech in our classrooms. We're only allowed to give the government's position. He called that, quote, positively dystopian. So far, there are 3 legal challenges that have been filed to Senate Bill 266, 2 of them by my friends and colleagues at New College. One was filed in state court by our New College union, and it focuses on the elimination of arbitration and employee protections for faculty. A second, filed in federal court by New College students and faculty, raises a First Amendment challenge, and that case will have a preliminary hearing with Judge Mark Walker of the positively dystopian phrase on October 23rd. I note that as a member of New College's Board of Trustees, I am a named defendant in both of these cases. That was never on my bucket list, but I hope that I can soon be not only a defendant, well, I can be a defendant, but one who lost 2 simultaneous cases. On September 29th, another federal suit was filed in Florida that challenges the trans bathroom ban. These actions all give me hope. I also have some small bit of hope that voters are soon going to say enough is enough. I can see some positive signs about local elections in the state. And while DeSantis continues to rail against the specters of gender ideology and critical race studies, his campaign is faltering nationally. More importantly, people are gathering locally, nationally, and internationally to speak out about the dangers our democracy faces and how we can respond. The Open Society Network, University Network, is partnering with New College alums on a project now called Alt-Lib-Ed to ensure New College students can access the court content they need. They also recently hosted a talk on YouTube by Judith Butler and Masha Gessen about the attack on gender studies in Florida. We need our allies to speak up and to amplify our voices. Because freedom of speech and academic freedom is what's under attack, speaking up is what we must do. So let me just conclude by thanking Patrick for bringing us here together, my fellow panelists for speaking out today, and all of you here on YouTube and in the room for engaging in this act of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm speechless, but fortunately we have colleagues who are following every word you're saying, taking notes. Kimberley Manning, Jean François Mayer. I'm sure you have questions, comments you'd like to add. My first questions would have been, what can we do? But Amy, you suggested fundamentally engaging in dialogue, speaking about it. So that's an opening. How to speak about it? How do we do this without being shut down, without endangering ourselves, without endangering our students? How do we protect society, the vulnerable? So I would open that question up to both Kim and Jean François in light of what we heard today.
So your question is, how do we protect from this kind of possibility?
The siege that was described.
The siege. Well, if I can just say a couple of introductory remarks, and then I'll move into that question, which I don't really have an answer for. So, but I will do my best. I think that one of the things that I'd like to say is that a year ago this time, I was doing a directed reading with two of my PhD students on LGBTQ social mobilizations and public policy. This is a course I've taught before. We worked the syllabus with the two students to make sure it was matching their interests. And one of my students is studying, it comes from Poland and is studying, in a sense, the organization of the anti-gender ideology movement in Poland. And I'm actually regretting I didn't make sure he got here today. But, you know, as we were talking through and doing lots of reading deep into what was going on in Eastern Europe and the mobilization and organization of this quote unquote anti-gender ideology movement, it was at that moment still feeling very much on the shores of Eastern Europe as a threat to democracy there. Now, of course, I was simultaneously aware of what was happening in the United States. And as somebody who's been working with parents of trans young people for many years now, reading online, hearing from parents of the dire situation that many were in the US, and keeping in mind, Florida is one state among many. There are something in the range of 500 bills that have been introduced in state legislatures that are notable for their anti-trans positions, whether it's about bathrooms, whether it's about care, whether it's about schools, etc. So this is a siege that is underway across the United States at this time. And bewilderingly, in some ways, targeting one of the most vulnerable populations in our society, which is trans young people, right? Who, you know, 40% of whom suicidal ideation is a regular thing, even before we get into what's going on now, right? I was having a conversation with one of my children, I don't know, as we were talking about what was happening in the States, maybe just about this time last year. And I said, oh, sweetheart, I said, there's no way this is going to happen here. I said, look, you know, just a year ago, the Canadian Parliament unanimously passed a law that rendered illegal what's so-called conversion therapy or reparative therapy, with the full support of all parliamentarians at that time, even though some of the more conservative members of parliament were doing so with their arms being yet twisted for that vote. But I answered very sincerely, this will not happen here. It's just, there's just no way. Well, here we are, 8 months later, and my daughter said to me, Mom, you said this wasn't going to happen here. And over the last, really 4 months, we have seen a cascade here in Canada at the provincial level. So, I say that, and it's interesting because when I was preparing for today, I was going back through news stories, and the CBC in April, so before I took off my little Pollyanna hat, the CBC was reporting on what was happening in the US and said, there are groups organizing in Canada. These are their names. They're organizing under the parental rights movement. It's really possible. And no, but again, I was having my magical thinking, my Pollyanna, So I preface my remarks with that. I think that, well, I guess a couple of things. I actually have a question before. I think part of what I need to understand better, I think you provided some of the background with respect to why we're seeing what's happened in New College. I think one of my questions for Marco is, who were Bolsonaro's constituents? Like who was this connecting with? And you had up on one of your slides evangelical supporters. So I'm assuming that's part of the constituency. Was this a constituency that was rural and poor and looking at elites in critical ways? Because of course we know in the US, right, Trump has built this sort of narrative that elites and professors like ourselves do not understand and are removed from the issues of common people who, so I'm interested in kind of understanding that better. Because I think that, and I have been thinking a lot about what's at stake in this moment where we have huge pushback, including here in Quebec. There's going to be another protest and counter protest this coming Saturday, right here in Montreal, regarding the parental rights movement. Who is coming out? Who are the people being mobilized? Why are they being mobilized? What are they being told? These are all questions that those of us who've been involved in supporting 2S LGBTQ students are asking. And I'm actually reaching out to people with whom I've worked in the past on other issues to see if there might be ways in which we might, the coalition building is, to me, one of the pieces that I think that we need to think about. So that would be one of my responses, but I feel like I also still need to know a lot more about what's happening here in Canada and in Quebec. And I'd be interested in hearing from you, Marco. Who were the people that were behind Bolsonaro?
Yeah, that's a good question and very paradoxical, because I was reading a lot of materials from very, very different perspectives. We have a lot of people trying to understand what is happening right now. What we know already is this is not new. It is not something that it happens from nothing. So I think for a long time, we underestimate how a lot of people and some organizations were working hard in a silent way and preparing this change. And to be honest, a lot of the left side of the democratical community was not aware about these people and how much they got really well organized and preparing the change. And although now we say, oh, we get surprised and we are not ready, these people, they know what they want and they know how to really organize all of this. So this is one important thing. In Brazil, what we noted in our elections, so Bolsonaro were elected with 55.13% of the vote. 55, it's I would say it's a big surprise for us. We know already that almost around 30% of the voters was a very conservative population, but the rest, 25, was people really floating from one side to the other. And they got a very strong propaganda using in a very, very intelligent way all the media and all the tools they have in their hands to move those 25% of the population that is not really, I would say, decided the attitude, who they should support, and they move this part of the population very fast for their side. And this 25% includes, and that's why it's a paradoxal, part of the elite and people who you never believe they will engage on that, they did, but also part of the very popular class, which is also very difficult to imagine, to understand how part of this oppressive people for a long time, they agree with this very conservative thinking that Bolsonaro brought. But we also have a lot of the part of the intellectual class. So university people also supporting this thing. Inside of the university, we had for the first time, and I have to, unfortunately, I have to say, like Amy said before, I spent 20 years working at the university, and the last years I started to be really afraid about talking about politics, gender, all those sensible topics at the university for the first time in my life. We have to really think twice where and who can we have in this conversation. It means if this happens inside a campus of the university, it means so many people also close by where we are supporting these things. And that's why I'm saying it's a very paradoxical, it's very complicated to understand, because we had in Brazil the feeling that inside of our families, for the first time ever, we have this group. Part of the family was, so we had been together for a long time, and then suddenly the family just broke in two parts, and we could not anymore inside of our family, very, I would say, well-known people, we could not talk anymore about politics. So it means I don't have the answer for you, but I know they use a lot of good propaganda to remove 25% of the population floating and undecided for their side. I don't know how they did, but they did it, and I think they well succeed in this try.
And I guess the reassuring thing is that 25% can be convinced to vote differently the second time around. So there is some silver lining, I guess, to a certain extent. This sense of feeling that you're on, walking on eggs and unsure about how to speak about certain topics, and in company that used to basically allow this is absolutely distressing. And I'm doing it myself, and I'm realizing I'm speaking like a politician now. I'm not using certain words. And this is something that is a fundamental change that we are seeing throughout most universities, I think. Jean François Mayer, I'd like you to maybe follow up on what Marco was talking about, this sense of the surprising adhesion of the intellectual classes along with the working classes with this Bolsonaro, with what Bolsonaro proposed in the context of Brazil that we know has been swinging left and right over the past generations. And what happened exactly? Why was that happening?
Well, that's an extremely important question. And first of all, thank you, Patrick, for the invitation to this fascinating panel. Thank you, Marco and Amy, for your presentation, Kim for the comments already. some of the comments and ideas that I had written down were already kind of trying to address this idea of what's happened, what explained this seemingly kind of abrupt emergence of these particularly aggressive measures. And I appreciate in particular, Amy, the end of Amy's talk, where you're also alluding to possible solutions, right? And I think it's important to really keep an eye on this, and as opposed to surrender to the temptation of thinking, well, this is something that is immutable, that this change is set in stone, and I don't believe that it is. So I'm going to comment on that, and a lot of my comments are going to be rooted in the work that I do in Brazil, and it's a very kind of modest contribution in that respect, but I do work with people in Brazil who are part of the some of the most marginalized category of people. They are domestic workers. Domestic workers in Brazil tend to be overwhelmingly women, and they also tend to be Afro-descendant women as well. Very often internal migrants, and more there are as well coming from the outside. And that's a little bit kind of, I'm going to try to maybe address a couple of the points that were discussed already through my experience with them, working with them. And I think one of the first elements to keep in mind when we're trying to understand how this happened, right, is kind of of course going back a little bit, you know, maybe a few years, because we don't need to go much farther than that, before, in this case, let's say Bolsonaro was elected, trying to figure out what the roots of the problems are. And there are several roots. Marco and I were talking about this not too long ago. I think one of the most important one is the fact that Brazil was rocked by an economic crisis before Bolsonaro gets elected. And it was a deep economic crisis, but it was not only an economic crisis in the typical sense of the kind of expected capitalist cycle. What happened in Brazil was that this economic crisis was also accompanied by a crisis of the if you will, social programs and social system that allowed a very broad segment of the what we'll call the lower class, right, of the poor population to emerge and to reach a level of that will be called eventually lower middle class. And that brought with it a great number of virtuous positive effects, but it also brought significant social challenges in Brazil. And even before talking about the economic impact, socially speaking, we start seeing a polarization at that moment, because the older middle classes, the well-established middle classes and upper classes, feel threatened. They feel threatened by the emergence of this new kind of lower middle class, because for a variety of reasons, but because among other things, they feel like their private spaces are being invaded. By private spaces, we have to conceive that very broadly. We're referring here to, among other places, shopping malls that used to be exclusively accessible to middle and upper class people, all of a sudden became accessible to kind of lower and lower middle class people. And the symbolism of it was enough that it triggered a very strong reaction on the part of some more kind of conservative segments of the population. But the economic changes and social changes don't explain everything. I think there's a number of also significant challenges related to a long by that point, by 2016, 2017, 2018, when we see the emergence of the Bolsonarista movement, a coup against the rightfully democratically elected president of the time, 2016, President Dilma, what we see is this also coincides with not only the emergence, but also the stabilization, the consolidation of extremely high rates of violence in Brazil, which affects principally, and that's worth emphasizing, the lower classes. It affects principally people who live in the periphery, the so-called poor. However, it scares very deeply members of the middle and upper classes, and that creates a scenario of a population that feels besieged, that something needs to be done, and it needs to be done immediately. And of course, Bolsonaro presented himself as a solution to at least these two evils, the economic crisis evil and the evil of violence. His solution to violence was more violence, is basically, you know, you kill first and you ask questions later, quite literally. This is one of the policies that were implemented for, you know, control of what they were called criminal elements in the urban peripheries. Okay. But so those are some of the roots. But another element, and again, that's something that we discussed with Marco, was the fact that civil society under the previous governments, which were center-left governments, which were progressist governments, which had built and set up a great number of inclusionary mechanisms, right, had tried to enhance governability by including people who had been traditionally marginalized, and again, lower class folks, in particular from the countryside, but also from the urban centers, who was in power at that time were people who were themselves a result of grassroots mobilization. President Lula was an ex-sheet metal worker. He was a unionist. He had very little access to formal education, great amount of sympathy for the poor, and that was reciprocal. When Lula got elected to power, among civil society, the most dynamic elements of civil societies, which tended to be leftist organizations, there was a sense of, at last we have someone in power who understands us. And in fact, Lula moved very quickly to demonstrate that he did understand the plight of the lower classes by implementing a great number, reinforcing a great number of social programs, anti-poverty programs, which is positive in a great number of ways, but that also led to the demobilization of civil society at that point, or at least a segment of civil society, which was the one that we saw traditionally, the strongest one, to the point where in the literature, those movements of the left, those unions of the left from where Lula was coming from, were called the true opposition in Brazil. Forget about they become demobilized. Why? Because Lula's in power. Lula listens. There's this ongoing story that, you know, in the unions, if you had a problem, you picked up the phone and the minister would pick up your call at the Ministry of Labor. And as a matter of fact, that's actually not really a myth all that much. It really did happen. People felt this. And in fact, what ended up happening was a reduction of mobilization. And so in parallel to that, as I think Marco really well pointed out, you see an emergence of more conservative movements, a reaction to these very progressist policies that will become very well organized after the 2016 coup against the president, democratically elected President Dilma. These groups will get very well organized. These groups will react against these progressist policies and will demand an end to violence, will demand an enhancing, a bettering of the economic situation. And that has resonance also with people who would traditionally support the leftist segments of the political spectrum, because they are also exposed to violence. They are also exposed to economic privations. And some of them, this 25% that Marco alluded to, will vote for Bolsonaro when the time comes. So some of the roots of this great challenge that will be put to great challenge to democracy that will be put by the election, the government of Bolsonaro. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that some of these roots are still very deep today, and some of these concerns are still very present today. The current government is trying to address them, but they remain ongoing, and a threat to what we considered this, as Marco very well put it, this democratic consolidation and stability, which we realized at that point, not only in Brazil, but also in the United States, how quickly these can be threatened. I think I've spoken a lot already, so I would love to leave the chance to some of the other participants to react and intervene. But I just wanted also to point out the fact that this very tendency is tangible, can be observed today. Who's the leading candidate in Argentina right now for the next presidential election is someone by the name of Milei, and his platform is extremely similar to that of Bolsonaro. And so I think, therefore, that Amy in particular was very right to alert us to the ongoing challenges that exist in that respect.
I think, yeah, the things I mostly am hearing is a sentiment of being besieged, hyper awareness of a sense of safety that might be eroded, but also this idea that civil society can easily be demobilized. And how do we remobilize civil society? Is it through crisis? Because it seems like they're feeding on the crisis, right? Create a crisis, maintain a crisis, and you can bring about change. Is that the answer for us to respond to?
I mean, I think one of the issues we need to grapple with, and I'm glad you brought up this question of the demobilization. I think a lot of us, as also Kimberley was suggesting, we thought we had made some gains. We thought that recognition of basic human rights for all people was something we could count on. We thought that the value of an education was something that we could count on. And we're in a moment when those values are really being called into question. And we can hope that this is sort of the one step back, although it feels kind of like a fall, before we move forward again. But I think we did sort of take too many things for granted. And I mean, we saw in the US the same thing after Obama's election. We thought certain things were going to get better, and they didn't on the border, and they didn't in a lot of different places. But there was a complacency, and perhaps also a point at which it became more difficult to be in opposition to the government because we had worked to elect the government, right? So we are facing a challenge, and I'm glad that you spoke to the composition of Bolsonaro's supporters, because I think Bolsonaro's supporters challenge what we expect from a traditional populist government, in that they did have a lot of support from the elite and from parts of the elites that were not Lula supporters, but more socially leftist leaning. And then, but they were willing to take on this fascist ideology.
Yeah, I think we always get surprised with part of these supporters, because it happens with people that you never believe that. And that maybe this is one important aspect. Sometimes we idealize the things. We know exactly where people are and how they will react to the situation, and then you get surprised in the end. Oh no, I was not expecting this. Sometimes it happens close to us in our family, but sometimes it happens in our workplace also. So in this case, it happens in the political level, and it's really surprised us. I would like to jump a little bit for my other field of work and give another example that can help in this thinking about what happened. In 2008, I'm working this right now with two sociologists, Brazilian sociologists. Our military force, the army, the navy, all of them, they started a project together to hire sport people, high-level athletes in 2008, with the excuse they would like to have better athletes in the army to participate in the armed Olympic Games. So that was the excuse in that time. And they did in a very excellent way a program for years and years. And now more than 30% of our delegation for the Summer Olympic Games are military people, hired and paid by the military force. So they use for a long time these sports heroes, and very strong in mass media, to communicate how important is the military service or the military power for our population. And they are very well succeeding in this program. But we, as a sports science people, we didn't realize before the election, when they start to use some military high-level sports in their propaganda, and then we start to think, oh, what's happening right now? And what we saw in the Olympics, the last 3 Olympic Games, in the podiums, the athletes coming to receive their medals and doing very military symbolic gesture. And we realized, oh, this is something strong that we didn't realize in that time. They are building a different way how to promote their forces in Brazil. So this is one simple example about how they were very well organized. And just to conclude, another one was in Brazil, the university students were traditionally a very strong resistance for any oppression, including for the military regime. The students were the very important and key persons to change this. But as Jean François said, we relaxed after the Lula government came to the power. We saw clearly in public universities how the students were demobilized. So they started to act as a group, and we cannot see anymore how they are organized to protect the university or to push what they believe in terms of democracy. And I think it is a consequence to have a better country in somehow for 10, 12 years, and they lose the capacity to mobilize and to work against this oppression system.
This is fascinating. It wasn't about the sports, it was about changing the narrative.
Oh yeah.
And you want to add
Sorry.
something? Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to draw a connection here between some of your comments. So Amy, you were talking about the bringing in the student athletes. And here you're talking about a similar kind of strategy. And just to bring it back to the question of gender, I think that there are ways in which sports has served as a vehicle for upholding a very binary view of gender, right? And so we see sort of this reflection of a larger project, which is appearing in unexpected ways, but yet has a coherence and a logic to it that I think that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Katie. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So we have people here with us online and in person. I'd like to open up the conversation if there are any comments, any questions in the room. We have mics set up, or we will any moment now. Douglas is setting this up. And online, I don't know if you've seen if you've screened any questions so far. Because I can't see anything.
If anyone has any questions, I can get a mic to you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, thanks first of all for a brilliant, albeit somewhat depressing and challenging group of talks. I'm really glad I was able to witness all of the really hard homework that you've done on this and putting it all together so well. I have two different thoughts sort of struggling in my head, and there'll probably be more than one question. But when I think about what's happening with DeSantis, and not just DeSantis in Florida, but many states in the US, I'm reminded of some previous movements. I'm reminded of Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, and how she details how this so-called populist movement called the Tea Party was actually financed and thought up, right, by hardcore neoliberal. Well, the two protagonists that come most readily to mind are the Koch brothers. I'm reminded of Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, where she does some amazing investigative journalism to link the Chicago School of Economics to the CIA and their role in toppling many social democracies, not just in South America, but even the Soviet Union, in Asia, etc. And I'm in the case of DeSantis, of course, you have the Manhattan Institute and Christopher Rufo and those characters and the Heritage Foundation. And so they're it seems like a populist movement, but really there's a script and there are legislative templates that are coming into play. And so my question for the Brazil side is there a similar sort of top-down institutional aspect to this? But I'd like to move to another question as well, and it has and it arises from Naomi Klein's most recent book, Doppelganger, where she talks about the fact that, you know, one of the crises we're going through in the academy is that words don't seem to be enough, right? We look around, we write our books, we write articles, oh, I've solved it, right? And there it is, and this is the way forward. While on the other side, and I hate to polarize this, but it is polarized, you know, she talks about how Bannon and Naomi Wolf, right? Naomi Wolf is the reason for her writing the book, this sort of psychological breakdown she has by being constantly mistaken for this hardcore conservative, you know, basically partner to Steve Bannon, right? And how they immediately convert. Well, first of all, they've stolen our language, right? Words like oppression, human rights, racism, genocide, right? To describe as victims, really, those who are most privileged, right? Those who have white supremacist leanings, et cetera, right? How they've stolen that language, and then how they activate so easily their network. And I guess, so the one question has to do with in Brazil, if there are similar top-down actors and financiers in play. And the other one is much harder, right? And it follows on Patrick's question is, how do we activate, right? I mean, this is one way, by coming together, right? But really the question ultimately is how to activate, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle this?
I'm not sure if I can answer because it's a very, very complex question. But yeah, yes, we have some top, I would say, supporters for all of this. It includes individuals, families, but also a very strong or different sectors. For example, all the educational, the private educational sector, it's really, really supporting all of this. It's clear in Brazil how the privatization, I don't know in English, but the word, but in the entire educational level, it's supporting the Bolsonaro government for a long time and pushing them as much as possible. So we saw in our public universities how the government cut all the budget dedicated for public educations, but in the same time, they use this money for well-equipped the army. But for the other side, we saw how big became all these private universities or elementary private education in the same time. So they just put their effort in another aspect, and they leave the door open for the entire private system to take care. And of course, they support the government with a lot of money and a lot of lobby in the government decisions. So we saw it clearly. And but it's more than that. The evangelical church in Brazil, they got today, the majority of the radios we have in Brazil is in their hands. They bought all the radios. So if you want to listen to radio, which is still a very important way how to communicate it, and the majority of the radios we have in Brazil, it's in their hands. So if you go soon and try to find, and you jump from one to the other, and it's their way how to communicate it. The message they're bringing in the radio is really, really strong, especially in the crown side, in the deep Brazil. So it's very complex, but yes, there's a lot of money coming from the top, but a lot of, I would say, also individual people, really, it's trying to seduce our population from the economic point of view. They seduce them, trying to say, oh, we are giving you a better life, but we know what they want. It's not really that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Marco already did a good job addressing the part about kind of say dark money. I would add one thing and then maybe just look at how do we activate, because I think that's really central, right, in our discussion. In Brazil, there's also a phenomenon that exists that's called the triple B. Which is that in Congress, there are elected members of Congress who belong to three groupings, okay? So they're called bancadas. So you got three groupings are called Bullet, Beef, and Bible, okay? And these three legislative groups tend to band together at moments where certain reforms are going to be introduced in order to safeguard their members and their constituents to a much lesser degree, but their members' interests. And this alliance, if you will, has access to not only political power, they can at times sway Brazilian Congress, but they also have access to enormous economic resources. That's also a factor of the way in which the Brazilian party system is set up, and that's a long story, so I'm going to leave it at that, but just wanted to put that on your radar screen that this coalition exists. And how do we activate? And I think this is one of the central questions that came from the presentations. And I just wanted to kind of go ahead with this little tale that I'm going to call lessons from the periphery, because this is something that happened while I was there in Brazil with working with some of my friends and colleagues with the domestic workers. And they said at some point, they said to me, so we're a union of domestic workers. And you know what that what that means? You realize what that means. And I said, well, I know it means a great number of things, but what do you mean exactly? And then, the leaders of the union said, well, it means that we never had any money. Okay, so we never had any money. And I said, but what do you mean? Because you're affiliated to, union centrals and confederations and federations. And according to the law, you're supposed to be getting some money. And they said, well, we did, but it never really was enough because we're a small union in our kind of leadership, but we're a huge union in terms of our members, and they can't help. They can't pay a fraction of their salary towards union dues because they just don't have enough money. And so what we've always had to do was fight for ourselves, even when the times were good. Okay, so how's that relevant to today? It's relevant to today because when the Bolsonaro government emerged, okay, in a moment where civil society in Brazil was the kind of more the left-leaning civil society, right, the organizations that were the usual suspects in kind of the opposition to the more conservative sectors, when they were in shock, what we saw were really interesting phenomena of the sort of which labor confederations and groupings would be calling that small union of domestic workers that represents a group of workers that's been marginalized, even when a sympathetical government was in power, would be calling them and would be asking them, what is your secret? How are you able to keep on going? Because in this context, side note to what Marco was saying also is when Bolsonaro comes to power, about a year or two before that, funding has been cut off. State funding to unions has been cut off because the state was who funded in its majority unions through a redistribution of wealth. It's been cut off. Most unions in Brazil by 2019, 2020 are kind of financially dying of hunger, okay? But not that union. And so they're called by the great confederation and federations and asked, what is your success? And they say, you know what our success is very simple, is we never stop organizing the base. And that's what they do. They did during the crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow in the presentation, when the state had all but abandoned the marginalized people from the lower classes, who was in the trenches were some of these civil society organizations, in particular this union that's very dear to my heart, who were offering services and care that the state refused, not couldn't, but refused to offer, right? And so part of the solution is just as simple as that, is what they call themselves is working the base, organizing the base, and outreach. going in zones that are traditionally not accessed by political power because it's considered to be not interesting. It's considered to be, these peripheral zones, these marginalized zones inhabited by people who have, quote unquote, little education, quote unquote, little culture, quote unquote, little political involvement. So why is it useful to go out there? Well, among other things, right? Forget about your democratic duties and responsibilities and inclusiveness, et cetera. It's because these people know how to pull through. Right. And that was part of the lesson that we learned then.
Never stop organizing the base. Words of wisdom from lessons from the periphery indeed. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? I guess we have time for one more.
If there are any questions on Zoom, and anyone
Yeah.
can just feel free to put them into the chat or raise your virtual hand. We'll also get those too. But we're not seeing any right now. But if there's anybody in the audience, of course, raise your hand. Okay.
If not, yeah, we have a question from up here.
It's not so much a question, but I want to come back to the question about the dark money. And this is something that I didn't focus on in my presentation and that other colleagues of mine have been working on. You mentioned the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation. I'll also mention Claremont McKenna Institute. And each of those three organizations are represented on our Board of Trustees at the moment, right? There's also ALEC as a legislative, as providing legislative languages for local and state governments across the country so that they can quickly mobilize and have copycat bills to sort of amplify effect. And yeah, so this dark money is really important. It's also coming out of the Hillsdale College. There's a push to control K-12 education curricula. And they put forward curricula and they're trying to, through using school boards to support alternative schools. You talked about private schools, but it's the charter school system in the US. So getting federal funds or state funds, local funds to pay for education that is private and excluding different viewpoints. And so all of these things work together, and the money trail is really something that has to be teased out. And I'll just say that there is currently a federal grand jury investigating this in Tallahassee at the moment. So if we're lucky, there will be some new information that comes out specifically about the money trail. So
thank you. So obviously we've only scratched the surface. Thank you all four speakers for your time, your insights, your generosity. Fortunately, this will continue tomorrow, so you're welcome to come join us at the Webster Library seminar room. So we've basically organized this in two workshops. The theme being what can be done. The first workshop will be at 1 p.m. So politics and education, popular resistance in Brazil in oppressive times. And this will be moderated by Jean François and Marco. We've got about 90 minutes to work through this. This will be followed by politics and gender, how to counter aggressive and anti-democratic programs. This will be moderated by Kimberley and Amy, your present. So thank you all four of you for your time today and in anticipation of your time tomorrow. And you're all very much welcome. And thank you to the Fourth Space, Doug and Isa, for your support. It's really always a pleasure. We always feel comfortable and safe, and everything's going to go well. We just know it. This is basically a space in which we can think aloud amongst ourselves, but also open up to the world and hopefully reach other people and be influenced by them as well. So thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, of course, to CISC for helping organize this. Just wanted to, thank you for coming in today for this conversation. It was very necessary, but also for everyone online, thank you for attending. We're going to be closing up the Zoom and live stream now, but just to let you know, this conversation remains available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit it. And please don't forget to join the second part tomorrow of this discussion. All right, everyone, have a great